All right, good stuff. Well, guys, welcome to building your own big data sandbox in less than an hour. I am going to try to take you through a number of things today. I'm going to set up a little bit, some of the different options and different choices we made in setting up this sandbox. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the other options that are out there, and we've kind of used them all, so I know which ones are working well and which ones actually they all work pretty well, to be honest with you. There's no really bad solution that we're going to talk about today. There's just preference, right? Everybody has personal preference. That's really what it's going to come down to for how you want to build this. I took the slightly more complicated path because I think it's the one that people are going to prefer to do the most if they can make their way through it, and that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. All right? So we're going to talk about big data in the cloud versus on-prem. I'm not going to get into 50 slides about why big data in the cloud is better, different, worse, none of that. We're just going to talk about the different options. On-premise, of course, a lot of people would still prefer to do things on-premise. I think
hey, Adam?
Yes?
We can't see your slide deck.
You can't?
No. Now we can.
Okay.
Great.
How about, are you good now? Can you see it?
Yep, now we can see it.
Rachel?
Yep, we're all good now. We can see it.
Okay, just making sure. I don't think I did anything. I love it when stuff starts to work and I don't do anything differently. We're going to talk a little bit about on-premise sandbox solution architecture. That's kind of what we're building today. You guys have seen a webinar already that we have posted up on our training on the T's for how to use HD Insight and do it in the cloud. And then we're going to go through and we're going to build it together. So I would not try to follow along today. I mean, I have a couple of things that I've sort of Martha Stewarted. I've got a couple of things pre-baked, like the OS install, and a couple of things that would just take a little bit longer. But I'm going to explain each one of those and explain the choices and what we did to get to where we are. So let's talk about cloud versus on-prem first. And the big thing that I want to highlight is there's a number of different good options if you want to start playing with big data. One, of course, is Microsoft's HD Insight Public Preview, which is a Azure-hosted, skinned version of the Hortonworks data platform for Windows. You also have the option to install the Hortonworks data platform for Windows. Version 1.3 is out in beta. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to do that install locally on a Windows server. Hortonworks also has a sandbox that you can go out and download, and I'll show you where that is. But if you go to their website, it's right there. It's very easy to find. And that they have a couple versions of that. Ones you can run in Hyper-V, VMware Fusion, and VirtualBox. So you've got a few different options to download that pre-baked sandbox. There's some tutorials in there. I'd recommend that you start with the sandbox. If you've never done anything with big data, the sandbox is a good place to start. Once you have been through those tutorials, I would recommend doing the one that we're going to do today, which is installing your own version of Hortonworks data platform for Windows. Cloudera, which is the other big vendor in that space, also has their own sandbox-style VM. Works very similarly to the Hortonworks sandbox. I don't think they have quite as many tutorials, but again, it's a good option. One of the things I know is a lot of people would like to do this in the cloud eventually, but most people need to be able to play with it on their laptop, or on a local machine, even when they don't have internet access, right? The cloud is great until you don't have internet access, and then it can be a challenge depending upon how your architecture is set up. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build a Hyper-V VM, and we're going to install Hortonworks Data Platform for Windows, the beta 1.3. Everything is out there available for you to go download right now. Nothing is restricted, no waiting for public preview, none of that kind of stuff. So if you were really brave and you were feeling like I gave you an extra good explanation today, you could actually go out and do this afternoon, hopefully, okay? So a couple of key steps that you want to make sure you keep in mind, not only when you're installing this, but as we're going through the actual implementation today on our webinar, is you want to make sure you get familiar with the documentation. That's out at docs.hortonworks.com. It's pretty good. Like most beta documentation, I know they're still making some updates and some tweaks, so there's a few little things that we've worked through, little command line typos and things like that. So if what you see me do on here disagrees with the documentation, my general rule of thumb would be, at least for until the product gets to general release, stick with what I'm showing you on here because we've already fought through some of those battles for you. Prerequisites matter. Boy, do they matter. As a guy, I don't want to stereotype, but we're not the best at reading directions. We're not always the best at prereqs sometimes. They really, really do matter. This bit me a number of times as we were starting to get into this technology. And the versions of the prereqs matter. So when they tell you to install Python 2.7, don't go, oh, Python 3.5 is out. Let me just install that one. It's not the same. Some of these are a little different than you're used to in the Windows world, so you have to follow directions very, very specifically. I'm going to throw out some tips, some things that you're going to want to know. Write those down or come back and watch the video. You will be very glad. Things like permissions tips and things you should do before other steps you should do prior to other steps and those types of things. And remember that we're dealing with beta software, right? Ultimately, we're going to go through a few more hoops today than we normally would. We're working around a few things like, some installer bugs and things like that Hortonworks is going to, have that all shaken out by the time, things go to production. So how do you get started? Again, if you're running a Windows machine, Hyper-V, obviously for Windows 8 would be preferable. VirtualBox, another as a free option, Parallels, for Windows and Parallels for Mac would all be really great options. Ultimately, anything that's going to enable you to have a hypervisor, run a VM. You can certainly install it locally on your machine. I'm a big fan of the VM concept because you can snapshot things and roll back and retry and do that a lot easier than you can do on your local machine. So without further ado, let's take a look at my VM that I put together for you. So you should be seeing my screen here, and you should see my my Hyper-V VM that I've got up. And you'll notice a couple of things. One, it looks pretty plain. Regular Windows Server 2008 R2 VM. I've got it patched up about 75% of the way. It doesn't have every single latest patch on it. It's patched up through about maybe a month ago. And you'll notice I have all these directories in here: Hadoop, HTTP, HTTP install, Java, Python. Those probably do not exist in your machine right now. So let's walk through what I've already done, which was a couple of prereqs and a couple of things to avoid things like download time and install time and those kinds of things. So I'm going to walk you step by step through what I did already, a little bit of pre-bake, and I promise it only saved me about 10 or 15 minutes. So my 60-minute time frame, I'm eating into that right now as I walk through the PowerPoint and that kind of thing, so I'm still going to make my time. Don't worry. Now, the first thing you need to do is start with a good foundation. The right foundation is Windows Server 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2012. Both will work. There are some additional security things that you have to jump through in 2012 just because it's a lot more locked down by default, especially Internet Explorer and those types of things. So typically, and again, this is for a sandbox development environment, consult your internal security and firewall folks. I have done my best to make this a simple process. So I've done a couple of key things. One, Windows firewall's turned off. Right? I'm inside my network. I've got Windows firewall turned on my local machine, so I'm not worried too much about it being turned on locally here on my server. I've also got all my patches up, so I'm in good shape there. I also have a few key settings that I did for my machine here. I gave it about 2.5 gigs of RAM. I would like to have a little more than that, but I wanted to make it realistic for you guys. This will run great on 2 virtual processors. I happen to have more available, so I added a few more. 4 virtual processors helps it finish something called a smoke test, which we're going to run in a little bit, just a little bit quicker. So just for time's sake, I wanted to give it a little bit more power. I did make it available so I can connect to the internet, from a from internal. So I have my Hyper-V network set up, so I have external internet access. That's very, very helpful because you're going to want to open up documentation and that kind of thing. Some of you will notice that I'm using Firefox. The only reason I install Firefox or an alternative browser on here is just from a time-saving perspective. there's a lot of file downloads and pop-ups and things like that when you're working in the support forums and those kinds of things. Internet Explorer 10 requires me to go in and turn off a lot of things in order to make that work a little bit smoother. Certainly those are there for security. That's a good thing. But just for ease of use, Firefox or another alternative browser usually works pretty well. I like Firefox only because it works well with the MSDN pages, your file downloads, all that kind of stuff. Everything you're going to want to install works pretty well. All right. The other thing I installed, Notepad++ or your favorite text editor, because you're going to be doing some command line stuff. I would highly recommend, if you don't like this one's free. Feel free to use whichever one you prefer, and that should work out pretty well. I've got all my files that I'm going to want, that I need for my prereqs and anything I'm going to use. I downloaded them to my local machine. I created a share so I can access that in my Hyper-V machine. I'm not going to need those very much, but we're going to walk through the process that I'm taking and how I know that I need all these things and all that kind of good stuff. All right? So I told you one of the first things that you want to do is get familiar with the documentation. So how do we do that? Well, you can go to docs.hortonworks.com, and there is inside their help documents, there's a section called Quick Start Guide for Single Node HTTP Installation, and that's pretty much what we're going to follow, right? And it walks you through different steps and gives you command line. I did not have to do any of these firewall rules because I turned my firewall off. Made that a lot easier. We'll talk about this cluster properties file and what that does. We're going to go through all of these steps, so don't worry. The prereqs, though, really, really important, right? So once we have our operating system installed and our patches installed, after that, we can start working. We can start putting our prereqs in. And so there's a few key prereqs. One is the C++ redistributable. We need .NET Framework 4.0. We need the Java JDK. 6U31 is the correct version. Make sure you use that. And we're going to have to do a couple things. So once we install that JDK, we're going to have to open up our environment variables. And I'll show you where we do this in just a second. And we're going to have to create a new variable called Java_home. And we're going to set that as the path for where we install our JDK. We're going to do the same thing with Python, except when we install Python, we don't need to add a variable. We need to add it to our path. So once we've done those installs, we want to make sure that we come back and we take a look at our environment variables. And you'll notice I created one here called Java_home, and I set the value to C/Java. Now, one of the things that's really important when you install this JDK is you cannot install it to a path that has a space in it. It's just not compatible down the road. So we can't install it to program files. So when you run the install, there's two places that you're going to need to make the change. And I just like installing it to C Java. I put everything in here. It makes it nice and easy to find. You may have a different preference, but that will work very well for you. Plus, it makes this environment variable very easy to troubleshoot, no issues, okay? The next thing, remember we installed Python, right? So we need to go look at our path. And you'll notice here at the end of our path, I put a semicolon, and I've added C:\Python 27, which is where Python's installed. And I know that that works because I can come out to my command line, and no matter where I am, if I type Python, it's going to actually open up Python and give me a command prompt. So we're in good shape. Now, for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time in this environment variable, system variable world, there's not a lot of complexity to it. A couple key things when you're separating your path. Variable values, you want to make sure you have a semicolon in there between each one. Don't have to put things in quotes or anything like that. When you're adding a new variable, such as Java Home, you just type in the value. Very straightforward, not too difficult to do. Now, one really important thing to remember is when you do make a change in this window, if you were to leave it open and go into command prompt and try to validate what you did, it will not work. It won't show up. The change is only persisted as soon as you click OK. So you have to make sure. I've done that 3 or 4 times, even the last couple of days. I make a change and I go run something and it doesn't work, and I go, oh, I forgot to close that window. Silly me. So we have now gone through, and I'm at a point where I'm ready to start installing the actual Horton DataWorks platform. So I've already installed these are all very simple installs. Next, 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 finish. So you're not really missing out on anything. But I've installed all 4 of these prereqs. As you can see, we added our variable for Java Home, and we added our Python path to our path variable. All right? So we're all good to go there. And we'll come back. There's a couple of things that you're going to want to do before you start doing the installation. Other than the prereqs, going back to that whole good foundation, you're going to want to change your computer's host name to something very easy and simple, because you're going to use it in plenty of places. So if it's Win375RJ4J63-6, that's going to be pretty painful to type in over and over and over again, right? So change it. I changed mine today to Big Data 60. I've called it Sandbox 1. I've called it, all sorts of things. So that's one of the things you're going to want to do. That'll necessitate a reboot. You can do that at any time, as long as you do it before you start, actually installing, the Hortonworks data platform, because you're going to want to change some properties and things using that value. All right. If you don't know what your computer's host name is, or you don't know how to access it, you can go to a command prompt, of course, type host name like I just did. It'll tell you what it is. If you're trying to figure out where to, go make that change, if you right-click on your computer in your Start menu and say Manage, actually, excuse me, it's Properties. You can come in here and say Change Settings and you can change your computer name. Right? Mine's in a work group. It's just a VM, simple VM, not on a domain. I didn't add it to our corporate domain or anything like that. You don't need to. Makes life very, very simple. Okay, just remember to reboot when you make the change. I know it's a pain, but it's a VM. It'll come back up quickly. All right. So when we get ready to install the data platform for Windows, we want to make sure we've done a couple of things, and we have. So we've got our Java directory here. I created a couple extra directories. So I've got this HTTP install directory, which I'll go through in just a minute. And then I created this HTTP and Hadoop directory. And those are just for us to, eventually put our installed files in. So we're going to use those directories when we create the configuration for our particular installation that we're going to do today. All right. Now, HTTP install is just a local directory that I created. It doesn't have to be named that. It could be named Bob. It doesn't matter. And what I did was I just extracted the install file that I downloaded from Hortonworks, and that's in here. And then I've got all my prereq files. So everything I know I'm going to need to install first, I just drop them in here, and then I can run through the installs, very quickly. Of course, those are done already. So we're ready to do our HTTP install. Now, one of the first things that you need to do before you're going to do this install is you need to look at this cluster properties file. And the reason that this file is so important is for those of you who ever use like an INI file or a config file, it's basically the same thing. And it comes default with a whole bunch of like long sample server names in here and all that kind of stuff. And you don't need that. What you need to do is go in and give it where you want to put your logs. So I put mine in C:\Hadoop logs, and where you want your HTTP data directory to be. That's going to be the install directory for HTTP, and where your HDFS name node is going to be. So I put that to C:\HTTP data. And then it needs to know what host all these different services are going to run on. Now, ideally, I'd have 60 nodes, and we'd mix and match, and there'd be a whole strategy behind this. For today, the strategy is really easy. Everything's going to run on this node. So I just say, basically do a find and replace, and I add my name in here after each one of these host entries. No commas, no semicolons, no none of that. Don't worry about it. It's pretty easy. The only other thing you need to change, again, the host name down here, and I leave everything else at default. If you want to change some of these values for Hive and Uzi, and you're at that point where you're more advanced, that's fine. It's not really going to be that big of a deal. Just remember when you go to connect to them that you didn't use the default names, and you're going to have to, actually authenticate. So that's an important one to keep in mind. All right. Now, there are a couple of things that we're going to do. And the first one, I've got these values here. We're going to go back to our command line. I've pre-built the command line string, and we'll go through it here in just a second. I'll show you exactly what, what's what in each step of that command line, so don't worry about that. Also, if you remember, we're following, roughly the instructions that they've got here. So they've got another example here right on Hortonworks website. So if you want, you can go and look at their version of it. But keep in mind, their version of it has a couple small typos in it. So just buyer beware. So my version does not have typos, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. Okay. So first thing we want to do is go to our HTTP install directory, and let's take a look at what's in there. So all my files are in this HTTP13 directory. I just called it that because I hate typing out really long directory names. So let's look at what's in there. We've got our cluster properties file. Okay, that's our config file for the install. And then we've got our actual installation file and a PowerShell script, which is going to kind of open up and do a lot of stuff under the covers to actually pretty much finish the install. This is all right out of the box, right out of the zip file. We didn't make any modifications to a PowerShell script. We didn't do any of that. You've seen everything we've done. We just changed the cluster properties file, and that's it. So what I'm going to do now is paste in my value here, and I'm just going to say MSI exec. I want to execute an MSI. This is the one I want to execute. It's in my local folder. My log is going to be at http.log. My HTTP layout, quote unquote, which is my cluster properties file, is located here. Now, the important thing you'll notice is up until now I'm using all relative paths. So I'm in this directory, so it's fine to put everything in that directory. Your cluster properties file in the command line has to be an absolute path. You have to tell it it's a c:config cluster properties.txt or wherever you're going to put it. Your HTTP directory, where is it going to get installed? So I said chttp Hadoop, that's where I want it installed. And you have an option here, destroy data, yes or no. No means it's not going to reformat the HDFS name node, but generally for sandboxes, unless you have a bunch of data stored on there that you can't afford to lose or that kind of thing, you want to say yes. It's going to make your life a lot simpler. It'll reset everything, reformat the name node, and that's what we're going to do right now. So when I hit enter, as long as the demo gods are with me, this is going to run the install. It'll take about, I don't know, 15 to 20 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, and that will install Hortonworks Data Platform for Windows. And then we're going to figure out a few things that we have to do after that to make sure that it's working, and get all the services started, and talk through where we go from there. All right. So it's actually running the executable. And one of the things that you'll notice is we now have this new directory called Hadoop install files. And this has all been unpacked from the installer, all these scripts, all these resources, all these individual tools that get installed, Zookeeper, Scoop, Pig, Oozie, Mahout, Hive, HCat, HBase, Flume, all this kind of good stuff, right? So as this runs, in a minute it's going to pop up and it's going to say, hopefully install completed successfully. I don't like the dialog that pops up because it has a little exclamation point arrow, which looks like it had an error, so don't get confused. It's actually it should go through nice and smooth for us. And once that completes, we'll take a look at a couple of other things. One of the things to make sure, and I don't have it in my path on here, which is why I prefer to use a VM, but depending upon the VM that you use, if we look at our path, there may be a path entry in here that goes to your program files x86 directory to point for something, right? You can't have that. So what you need to do is take that path entry and shorten it. So instead of saying c:/, program files x86, okay, good, our install is done. You need to have it say c:/, program ~2. So c program tilde 2, like that. You need the short name. So make sure you do that to anything in your path variable that points to x86. Down the road, some of the services have a little bit of a challenge with doing that. I wanted to type it out there on the screen and show you exactly kind of how that looks, just in case. That's definitely confusing for some folks who've never had to do that before. So our install completed successfully, so we're in good shape. So there's a couple things we need to go do. So one, normally we would just go and we'd say C space HTTP Hadoop. That's where my stuff got installed. I've got lots of things in there. Let's go look at it over here. I've got all my installed directories. Everything's good. And I should be able to go start my services, right? But there's a couple things we want to check before we start services. One is, for some reason, a couple of the services don't seem to enable themselves by default. So we want to come in here, especially Flume, and say manual. And we've got some HBase servers that we need to set to manual. Don't ask me why this happens. It's just part of the beta process. So I'm just helping you guys out because you will get error messages that services didn't start and all that kind of good stuff. And you won't be a happy camper. All right. So we're going to close that. And then the other thing we want to do, because right after we start all the services, we're going to want to make sure that that we have enough permissions to do what we need to do. So in order for the smoke test to run, so we want to make sure that we go in here to users and groups and administrators. And again, it doesn't require administrator access. You can individually grant file share access and go through all that. I'm trying to keep this very simple for you guys. The install creates a Hadoop user. It's a local user. That's what it's using to run the services, if you notice that. We want to say OK, and just go ahead and add him to the administrators group. Actually, I'm going to do something really quick. I'm going to take him out so you can see the error message that you'll get if you forget to do that. That's very important. So there's two more steps that we want to do. One is put the Hadoop user in the admin group. The other is fix something in the Flume service before any of this stuff will fire up. But in order for you to see the error message that you will get, inevitably because you will forget to do that, like I always do, I want to try to start the services with without the change to Flume, and you'll see what happens, and I'll show you. So you'll see over here we've got services, and they're starting. You'll see down here on the right, they're all starting up, which is good. That's what I like seeing. And you'll notice it's paused here on the Flume agent for a minute, and it's going to error out. And I'm expecting that because I know what I need to go change. Oh, nice big error. Nice big error. So it sent all the start commands, and it's going to come back in a minute and tell me most of them started, and that's fine. I know most of them started. So in order to fix that, what I need to do is come in here, and I believe this will be fixed. It's been reported as on the forums for HTTP 1.3. If I come in here to the Flume directory, there's a Flume service.xml document, and you'll notice the service is actually running as Flume agent. So we need to just rename this file to Flume agent, and we should be good to go. I'll restart my Flume service. Bam, good to go, no problem. All right, so now that our services are running, there's one other thing that I can do, and we've got this thing called smoke test. And the smoke test is going to take every single service, and it's going to run something against it, kind of a sample that you don't have to configure. It's just going to tell you whether it works or not, which I think is very, very cool. So if I knew how to spell, it would be very, very cool. So we're going to just say run smoketest.cmd. Run the command, don't run the PowerShell. You can run the PowerShell script directly if you want to, but the command is a little bit easier. So I'm going to run this, and I get all sorts of errors, right? I mean, just blowing up all over the place. And you'll notice, though, they're all the same. I keep getting right error, right error, right error. And if I were to go and look in the log, I would see that I have all these different logs. I can also go over here and take a look at, let's say, let's do my, I'll tell you what, I'll just go back to the regular log directory. That should be fine. And if I go and I look in my Hadoop log directory, I should be able to find, here we go. If I want to pick through all of this, I can find what the error was, but I don't really want to be honest with you. It's kind of a pain. It's hard to read. I'm getting a write error on every single possible thing that's trying to run. So I know that that's probably permissions related. It's having trouble accessing files. So what I need to do is come back over here to my administrator, add my local Hadoop user, and then there's a very important step because I made a change. My command prompt is not aware that I made that change, so I have to close the command prompt and reopen it and go back here and say run smoke test.cmd. Now it should work. It's already better. I don't have red all over the screen. All right. So this is telling me now my install looks good. It's going to run a test on every single service to make sure that it is working like it's supposed to, and that all of those things are going to work the way that I expect them to, which is really, really important. So it's going to take and run a word count MapReduce job using a local CMD file, and you'll see all the work that it's doing there. Any errors should pop out in red, so they're pretty easy to read. This is one of the reasons that I gave 4 cores to the machine, because as you can see, it definitely helps scale the performance a little bit better, right? So I should have given it a little more memory, but 3 gigs of memory probably would have been plenty, just because it's pushing kind of hard. I've got all the services running. Generally, you don't need every single service running either, by the way. I mean, of course, you can shut some of those off, but to test and make sure the install, excuse me, that the install is working appropriately, it's really good to get them all enabled, let them all run, and then you'll probably go back and only use 1 or 2 of them. So, that's kind of important. So you'll notice we're now looking at, we passed our HCAT test. We're doing Hive test. That looks good. Hive Server 2, Scoop, Uzi, Mahout, all these are passing like clockwork. That's exactly what we want to see. Very, very good stuff. Now, you'll see errors here if you have, for instance, the wrong version of Python installed. It won't be able to run some of them, and it'll just say, it'll give you kind of a strange error, right? Which is one of the reasons that you want to really pay attention to the prerequisites. Really, really, really important to do that, all right? Now, there's a couple last-minute things. This is going to finish successfully, and I'm pretty happy with that. There's a couple other things that we want to do to make our life a little bit easier. You remember how we added Python to our path, right? Well, the other things you're going to use pretty often are going to be pig and hive. So we want to make sure that we add pig and hive to the path variables as well. So if we open those up, and I'm going to go to my path, and I'm going to say edit. There we go. See over here, all my smoke test passed, all my zookeeper, my job tracker, all that kind of stuff, that's all passed. It created database, it created tables, dropped tables, added data, did all kinds of good stuff over here on HBase. So everything looks pretty good. So I'm going to edit my path right over here because I want this stuff easily accessible now that I'm going to use it. And I've already copied out the path entry. The best way to remember this is, since I need Hive, I'm going to go to my directory where it was installed, HTTP Hadoop, and that's based on my configuration, right? Remember, I told it to install there. You can pick something totally different. That's the important thing to remember. And I want to go to Hive and bin for where the binaries are at, and that's the path that I want. That's what I've copied out already down here. I'll just copy this out here. I will go back to my environment variable here, and I'm just going to semicolon at the end. Just going to paste that in. I'm going to put another semicolon because I'm about to go get my one for pig. And I could do this for all of my services, and ultimately I probably would the more I use them, but certainly to make your life a little bit easier, you can go ahead and just start with Hive and Pig. Also, one key thing to keep in mind here is I'm going to go ahead and close this out and reopen this. If I type in Hive, for example, it doesn't find Hive. I have to actually say OK, new command prompt, and I should get, there we go, and Hive's open up. So now I can say show tables, and it should tell me what tables I have in Hive. Awesome, those are my test tables that got created during my smoke test that I just ran. If I want to, I can also say pig, and it should open up a grunt shell, so I can run my pig commands. So that's good. I'm in good shape there. Additionally, some follow-up things that you can do. There's an ODBC driver that can be set up from Hortonworks. And of course Cloudera. There's also one for HT Insight. My recommendation would be play around with this first. Get comfortable with the command line. One of the things you can do here is you'll see, of course, we also have the web interface, so you can see how your name node is doing. You can come over here and look at the actual HDFS file system. You can come into Hive and look at, we've got Hive smoke tables. All of these smoke tests, there's not a lot of data in them right now. I think it all gets cleaned out by the smoke test. We can look at all of our name node logs, what our capacity is. By the way, the other thing that I really like about building these sandboxes is you don't need a lot of storage. I mean, unless you're truly going to use, 2 terabytes of storage in your sandbox. I mean, I would play with smaller files, maybe like 20, 30 gigs worth of files. And you've got plenty of room. I mean, Windows, I created an 80 gig VM, and I've got, about 30 gigs, left over by the time I put data, and I put Excel on here because I want to be able to use an ODBC driver and connect to Hive, and do that kind of stuff. That's all been kind of shown off in other demos, so I didn't configure that today. But the other thing it allows you to do is I save all my command lines for everything that I'm going to use to make sure that when I come back, that they're there and they're easy to use, and I don't have to worry about trying to refigure them all out. I take a lot of notes as I'm figuring these things out. I have a bunch of little points, and you do this before this and those kinds of things. But the biggest thing you want to try to remember is do all your prereqs first. Those are really important. And then make sure your cluster properties file is set up. Make sure you have an absolute path to the cluster properties file in your command line. Then go ahead and make sure that your path variable doesn't have any program x86 stuff in it. You know how to fix those. I showed you that. Go ahead and create your installation command line entry in your text editor. Run that installer. Make sure that all the services are enabled. You can set them to manual or automatic. Manual works pretty good. That way they don't automatically start up. If you have to fix the Flume service, go ahead and do that in the XML file. That's important. Make sure you validate that all your new system variables and path entries are correct. One thing you'll notice is you've got a whole bunch of new system variables now, right? Flume home, Hadoop log directory, all of these things, right? There's not a great way for you to personally validate those, but certainly you want to know that they're here just in case you do run into an issue and you get support or trading emails to somebody and they ask you what the value is for Hive_ops for options. Well, you're going to want to know where to find that, right? Generally, you're going to be talking about a system variable or an XML file that's somewhere in your install directory. All right. Once you get all your local services started, you can make your Hadoop user an admin or give them the appropriate permissions for your environment, run your smoke test, add anything else to your path, and your sandbox is good to go. You're ready to rock and roll. One of the things I want to point out is there's a lot of great support through forums from Hortonworks. So if you go to their site, you can say community forums. This is where I get most of my help when I have questions, so it works pretty well. The other thing I would suggest is if you can go, the knowledge base is up here. There's a lot of good stuff in here too. There's some kind of how-tos and best practices and things like that. It's not perfect, just like any other knowledge base, but the forums are fairly well maintained. There's staff members that seem to do a pretty good job, going through and making sure questions are getting answered and that kind of thing. So we've been pretty pleased with the results there. Last but not least, where to go for more info, and then we'll do some questions. So stay tuned to Training on the T's. We've got more big data going on this week. We've got some big data, Hadoop, data science type training classes that we're working on right now. I would expect to see those later this year. Some pretty exciting stuff. Follow me on Twitter or connect with me on Facebook or LinkedIn. I push a lot of content generally around these types of topics, so if you're looking to stay in touch with what's going on and you don't have time, you want somebody else to curate it for you, use my wasted free time to maximize yours, or you can subscribe to my blog at ajbigdata.com. All right, so I'm sure that we don't have any questions because something like this with command line and all that kind of stuff would never spawn a lot of questions.